Yeah. Okay, everyone. Today we're going to finish the final three games of the series, game 6, 7, and 8. And yes, I know there was an extra exhibition game in Prague, but really that game only meant something to Stan Mikita. So for these three games, and I'll try to keep them tight without going into a ton of detail. Um, and I'm kind of doing this, of course, off the top of my head. Just it's not like I have a lot of notes or anything in front of me. It's just my own memories now of these games and what comes up and what I'd like to say about them. So, yeah. So heading into game 6, of course, you've had a couple of things that have happened. Um, Canada played a very good game in game 5, yet still lost 5-4. Tony Esposito was great for 2 periods and then was kind of average in the final period when the Soviets got all their goals. You had as I talked about, the things that are going on behind the scenes that are giving this kind of annoyance and pressure to the Canadian team. 3 Canadians went home. There was supposed to be quite a large number. The initial discussion, there was going to be up to 10 guys that were going to be leaving on a plane before game 6, and it turned out to be only 3. And those guys got quite vilified by the press for kind of abandoning the team. But you have to remember, this is a high pressure situation. Everybody acts in different ways, and their teams were putting a lot of pressure on them back in the NHL that, hey, if you're not playing in Russia, you should be here practicing and getting ready for the season and the money that we're paying you. So they had some pressure on them as well. And I think other than Gouvernement, because Gouvernement claimed that his only reason for going back is that his wife was really sick, that his wife was very ill, and so they decided to just get back to Canada, and so that she could heal. That was his presentation. But certainly, they also felt that there were 10 players that were going to leave. That it was not just going to be the small handful that did go. But anyway, that's going on. You've got the Soviets at this point feeling very confident. They only have to, in essence, tie one of the remaining 3 games at home to win the series. Canada now at this point must win all 3. And other than a small handful, again, of people, the team itself, and a few really strong supporters in Canada, I don't think almost anybody would have really thought they could win the series. But they not only was it that they believed they could win, they felt that they had to. Right? There was an interview with Frank Mahovlich, and he had talked about how if they lost this series, it would be a mark against them for the rest of their lives. And that's really how they saw it. That if they had lost this series in 1972, it wouldn't have mattered how many Stanley Cups they won, how many scoring championships they had. Their entire career would have been, they certainly felt, and probably rightfully so for a long time, would have been marked by this particular loss. That's how they would have been remembered. And so they knew that. And then the combination of just what they were going through was, again, the sense of tightening the unit together. Heading into game 6, there's a very, very big change. And that is Canada, which had only been using 2 goalies. Ed Johnston was the goalie that generally dressed as the backup in all the games, but never played. And in fact, it was claimed that he was the best goalie in training camp. That out of the camp that they had, Johnston, and I think he only played a bit of one game in Sweden, is all that he played in the tournament. He never got into a game against the Soviets, which I think he was a bit disappointed, because of course he too had been promised that he would play, and felt, probably rightfully so, that he played very well and deserved to be in the. And I don't know how he did in Sweden, actually. While I'm talking here, I can look it up. Sorry, he played in game 2 in Sweden, and he gave up all 4 Swedish goals. So I guess he played the whole game. Yeah, he played the whole game in game 2, gave up the 4 goals. Who played in game 1? Exhibition game 1 was goaltenders. Esposito Esposito played the whole of game one. So anyway, through the first 5 games of the series, Tony Esposito is by far the best goaltender, not just for Canada, but is probably playing better than Tretiak. Esposito is easily the best goaltender. Dryden had been terrible in the 2 games in Canada, just not good. And what's so interesting is that here with Game 6, in a must-win situation, Sinden and Ferguson choose to go to Ken Dryden to play Game 6, which is a stunning thing that he's not played well. And of course, we're not there in practice. I can't see how he's practicing or not practicing in the 10 days between Vancouver and Moscow. But they had felt from the beginning, I guess, that the series was going to be so stressful on the goaltenders that they had to use 2 goalies. That one of the things that was claimed that hurt the Soviets was that Tretiak played all the games. That his backup, who and was supposed to, as I heard again, was supposed to play a game, but there's a rumor that he had got injured in a practice or injured at some point, and that Tretiak had to play all 8 games. And the contention of the Canadians anyway was that you had to use 2 goalies. And so it's interesting that they go to Dryden in Game 6, and Dryden has one of his better games of his career in international hockey. He never had a really good. He had played some games in the 60s against the Soviets, did not play well in the first 2 games, really did not play all that well in the game in 75. The New Year's Eve game, played okay in the 2 games that he played in the Challenge Cup in 79. They changed in Game 3 to Jerry Cheevers when the Canadians lost 6-0 in that final game in 79. But this is for international hockey, this is one of Dryden's, by far, it maybe is probably his best game that he played. So you had that, first of all. They had goaltending. They also had, this was a very intense, warlike game. Probably of all the games in the series, this is the most warfare-like game that was in existence, and is surprising that it totally didn't spoil over, especially due to the refereeing of Joseph Kampala and Bader, the West German referees, who were there. And there's 2 pieces to this, right? There's one side which officiating in Europe is different than officiating in Canada, certainly in the 1970s. It's a bit closer now, and Canadians have had 40 years to get used to European refereeing, which is much more strict and doesn't really relate to the flow of the game, is just, very, very different. And when you watch the games, like when I watch the games now, as somebody who's played hockey for a long, long time and watched hockey for 50 years, the way hockey is refereed now, most of the penalties that the Canadians received in 1972 would be classified as penalties today. There's a lot of them. Now, some of them were dives and things that probably should not have been called. There were certainly things that the Soviets should have been called for. So you've got one side of it, that the refereeing from the standpoint partially of European officiating was not tremendously far off from what you would expect at that time period. Canada was just not prepared. Even the one game that they played in Sweden really did not prepare them for these referees. Now, the referees they had in Game 5, which was Uwe Dahlberg and Rudolf Bada, one from Sweden, one from the Czechoslovakia. They called a fairly North American-ish game, and certainly Dahlberg was the main. We would call him certainly the main component of that Game 5. And even though the refereeing was a little stricter, I think Canadians were okay with the type of officiating they got. They were not okay with this officiating. Now, I said, okay, the refereeing is different, but there is also the other side of it, that without question, these 2 referees were highly influenced by Soviet Hockey Federation. They knew that if they did things that the Soviet Federation, they called penalties that the Soviet Federation didn't like, they probably were not going to be refereeing international hockey games ever after that point. They knew that. And whether they wanted to admit it or not, they were going to, in tight situations, they were going to favor the Soviets. So you have that happening. In the course of the game, I think the actual penalty numbers are, and that's including a misconduct to Canada, but I think it's 31-4. I think that was I think that was the penalty numbers. And so certainly Canada felt like they were uh, they were targeted by the officiating. And in some ways that's true, in some ways that's not. They were not prepared for what Europe was going to be like from the officiating standpoint, and they were not prepared with the two referee system. The two referee system, which was still used in international hockey. And again, these are all bizarre things that Hockey Canada agreed to. But it seemed like Hockey Canada was in such disarray when they made this tournament, when they agreed to this series, that that they were. Was this ever weird? I'm doing this comment, right? I'm doing this video right now, and on my little news feed came up like an NHL logo. There's no reason there should be an NHL logo for on any news story while you live in the country I live in. Yeah, the joys of the internet. So anyway, so this game is very intense and very, very nasty. And if you watch it carefully behind the scenes, if you watch the game the way I watch a game, which is I'm not really focused on the puck. The puck is in my stream of, like, I know where the puck is and I know it's happening, but I'm obviously live and in person. I see much more of the game than you see on television. I'm catching everything. I was at a game. I think I mentioned this in my other book, but I'll mention it here just for you guys. I was at a game with my girlfriend at the time in Calgary. I took her to a Calgary Flames game while I was writing my first book. So I had all sorts of free access to Flames games at the time. So I took her to a game. And in the middle of the first period, she's like staring at me, like just staring at me. And I'm embarrassed. I'm like, have I, got something on my face? Have I, not shaved properly? Like, and I finally had, what's wrong? And she just said, I'm looking at your eyes. What do you mean? And she just looks at me and said, everyone's eyes in the rink is going one place. Your eyes are looking somewhere else. And she just said, you're seeing a different game than everyone else is watching. And then she added, I just once wish I could see the game the way you're seeing it. It must be an incredible experience. Which, until she had said that, I really didn't realize that I probably do, just from all the years of playing, all the years of coaching, all the years of watching. You start to know what to watch. I'm not as interested in the guy with the puck moving along the boards. I'm interested to see how fast the winger is going, charging to the net. Is he charging to the post? Is he going to a more of an open area? How fast is the back checker going? Has the back checker got space between the puck and the player that he's checking? I'm registering all of that in microseconds. So if you watch this game, if you watch Game 6 in the sides of it, what can be seen around the periphery, you can see very carefully the slashes, the spears, the butt ends, the kicks. It's a pretty nasty game. And we'll get to the Clark slash in a minute. That gets the attention, but the entire game itself was really, really nasty. Canada's penalty kill is outstanding in this game. Combination of Dryden, of course, helps. When your goalie's stopping the puck, your penalty kill is very good. Always. So that helps. Canada scores, I think, all of its goals in like about 5 or 6 minutes of the second period. Rapid succession, get a lead, and then pretty much hang on. In the middle of the second period, though, that's where the famed Bobby Clark slash happens on Harlamov's ankle, which at the time within the club itself, this is a good idea. Like, to anyone on Team Canada time, that's a good idea. Like, this is their best player, and they have to win. So this is the kind of thing, I mean, if you think of the three nastiest players in hockey history, well, if we had to spray Cleghorn 4, so you got Cleghorn, Ted Lindsay, Bobby Clark, and Dale Hunter. That's it, right? These guys are at the top of their own list, and they'll do whatever they have to do to win. And it was a huge change. It was a change to the Soviets that signified they're in a war. And it made them say that they didn't know what the Canadians would do at this point. Now, would I say that the players were necessarily afraid? No. But were they intimidated? Definitely. And you'll more see that as they go into game 7. The first part of game 7, which is also very intense, the Soviets, certainly at the beginning of the game, are a little less interested in going after the puck because they just had no idea what anybody might do. I mean, they're nasty. Like, don't get yourself wrong. Butt ending a guy, that's how I got a collapsed lung. I got a collapsed lung from a guy on Brockville who drilled a butt end into my side of my chest. You couldn't see it. I'm sure if there was a video of that game, it would look like he just hit me. But the butt end literally collapsed my lung and put me out of business for 3 weeks, and was the start of various lung problems through the course of my life. This was going on constantly in the series from the Soviet side. So this was, this one just happened to be so flagrant and easily seen. Over time, this becomes one of the most talked about events, and it's a thing that a lot of people say, "Oh, this was a terrible thing, and this is a terrible way for Canada to win. It's embarrassing," or whatever else. It's easy to look at such things in hindsight, 10, 20, 40 years later. The conditions that were there at the time were warfare conditions. Ish, without weapons. But like I said, I had a collapsed lung, and I mean, just a little bit of different things, you could have died right there on the ice, right? So you once the game gets to a certain level, you are at points where you can be injured for life or even dead. And that's the level of play. So that the Soviets had never seen this kind of nastiness against them previously. They had obviously been in some nasty games with the Czechs and the Swedes and whatever else, but this was new, and this scared them to some degree. For Canadians, they've been playing like this since they were junior. This was no big deal, and they felt in their favor. We'll talk at the end of this how this actually becomes a huge detriment to Canadian hockey going forward. The whole point of this entire series, but that's the element of that particular play. And it does have a huge impact because it pretty much takes Harlamov away from the Soviets for 2.5 games. It changes the mindset of everything, and it changes some things in the Canadian mindset. Is it like, as a coach, would I have suggested it to do that? No. Would I have been, probably, if I'm behind the bench during that series, in a pretty in my coaching days, in a pretty fever pitch over what's going on and the officiating and the treatment and the hotels and what's happening with the wives and everything else. You would get to, there's a certain point you get to, and I've been in those games myself. I've been in some of those games where you kind of warn your opponents, or they're hacking you and they're swinging sticks at you and getting their stick in there, and eventually you just say, enough of this, and you just wood chop somebody down yourself. You just drive a stick down their throat, and you just say, we're gonna finish this problem now. So I don't doubt it was a similar thing. It was so flagrant and so open that it became an obvious focus. So I think that's all we should say about Game 6. Just to go into that, it puts Canada in the series. It proves that they can win, and it does throw some problems back to the Soviets. So when you go to Game 7, Canada does make its rotating goalie change. Tony Esposito is back in. Harlamov is not playing for the Soviets. And the Soviets begin to realize that they kind of now have to win this game. The refereeing was I would say, for European refereeing, Game 7 was refereed pretty well between Dahlberg and Bada. It was a fairly decently called game. This game, if we simplify it to some events, one is the combination of Yakushev for the Soviets and Esposito and Henderson pretty much dominating the play. Both of those players now, as the game has got into crunch, intense time, these three players take control of the series. With the score tied, I think it's 4-4. Late in the third period, we get one of the obvious, the other nasty moment of the series, and that's the kick by Mikhailov on Gary Bergman, where he kicked him so hard that it went actually through the kick. The blade went through the shin pad and kicked him and badly cut his leg. And of course, all hell breaks loose behind the Soviet net as even Ivan Kornway tries to go after Mikhailov. The benches did empty, even though you can't really see it on the way the cameras were positioned. Somehow the thing was calmed down to a point that was, what to do with it. What was really one of the first things that was interesting was this was a point where any fighting in the series was supposed to be, you're supposed to get kicked out of the game, and there was, both Bergman and Mikhailov were given 5-minute majors for roughing, which were, because it was called roughing, not fighting. They didn't get kicked out of the game. They had no impact in the rest of it. But it was during this 4-on-4 situation where both teams were short a player with a little bit more space on the ice. It's one of the reasons Paul Henderson was able to score literally one of the greatest goals of all time. The goal that he scores in Game 7, where he puts the puck through the defenseman's skate and scores while he's literally falling on the ice, puts it in the top corner, is like, it's like he could try that 1,000 times and he's not going to score it. That's almost like, I know after the series, Henderson kind of felt like he'd become like Jesus, that God wanted him to do all this. And I think he became a born again Christian or a preacher. I'm not sure how far, I can't remember how far he went with this, but this kind of stuff, this kind of series affects you. And a number of players, when this series was over, I don't know the specifics on the Russian side, the Soviet side, but certainly on the Canadian side, there were guys that, when they came back, had nervous breakdowns that just couldn't. The pressure and the stress of what they went through was just so great that they pretty much couldn't continue anymore. They were like useless hockey players for the rest of their career. Others became somewhat, I can't say they became stars necessarily, but their game, and certainly Bobby Clarke. Coming out of the series, Bobby Clarke, he wins an MVP award, his first MVP award this season with the Flyers. And everything changes. When he came back we'll get to that at the end of the changes, but certainly Clarke is the biggest change going in the NHL. But that's Game 7. And then we head to Game 8. And now, with Canada actually tied in the series, a change starts to happen now in Canada, where it is, they now believe Canada can win the series. And the Soviets now believe that Canada can win the series. Finally, they're jumping into a pretty serious place. And this is where the next round of refereeing games start, where there had always been a promise that the Canadians were clear that they did not want the referees of game, just like the Soviets didn't want the referees of Game 2 to do the rest of the series. Canada didn't want Bader and Kampala to referee the series. And they were told at the end of Game 7 that they could have Dahlberg and Bada again for Game 8, which was interesting because one of the referees, of course, is Czech, so that would make him technically one of the communist bloc. But of course, at the time, anyone from Czechoslovakia sees the rest of the Soviet Union very differently, even though they're Soviet bloc. But once it was ready, once they were ready to talk to the officials, they were told that the officials are unable to referee. That they would have to get they would have to get Badr and Kampala, or no, I'm sorry, first it started that the Soviets claimed that, yeah, you made that change for us, but Badr and Kampala are scheduled to do game 8, and that's who's going to call the series, and there will be no change. So the Canadians were very clear that if these guys referee the game, we're going home. That was exactly how they laid it on the line, that they'll leave. And as I understand, it was the Canadian embassy staff that stuck their nose in this to say, you can't leave, you can't not play the game, you're going to have to play it. Which, of course, the Canadian contingent of players and management was very, very upset about that. Eventually, a decision gets made. Well, how about each group picks a referee? So the Soviets pick Kampala, of course, one of their West German referees. The Canadians choose Dahlberg. But as soon as they choose Dahlberg, they were informed, no, Dahlberg is sick now and he can't referee the game. To which certainly Alan Eagleson, no stranger to lies and cheating himself, right? But he just exploded with, what do you mean? I just had breakfast with him. He's fine. And Eagleson went to call him. He called his room, and Dahlberg pretty much told him that he was told that if he referees this game, he'll never referee another international game ever. And so the Canadians wound up choosing Bada to call the game, which, as it turned out, was a very good choice for them in the end, but it becomes a mess. So you've got all of that absolute mess happening before the game would even start. Within the first 4 minutes of play, the Canadians get 4, and these are, as opposed to the penalty calls that were being called in Game 6, for example, these penalty calls in Game 8 are very marginal, like very, very marginal. Kampala has called every one of them. Bada did not make one of the calls, so they were all Kampala penalties. The Soviets score 1 on the power play, and after the next, I guess it'd be the 4th penalty to J.P. Parisi, the entire team pretty much realizes that they're dead in the water if this continues. The combination of the Canadian bench explosions, as Harry Sinden said later, him and Ferguson should have both been kicked out for how they behaved. But they threw everything they had on the ice, from benches and sticks to chairs, whatever they could find was thrown on the ice. The culminating moment is when Parisi had been given a misconduct, and he skated up to Kampala and worked his stick back like a baseball bat and was ready to crush it into his skull, and like at the last second somehow stopped from doing it. Was given a game misconduct. It didn't make any extra difference from the standpoint of penalty time. There was still only a 2-minute the original 2-minute minor. These, the misconduct and the game misconduct were just tack-ons, didn't really mean anything for manpower situations, but it did mean that he was playing with Esposito, so your first line left winger is now gone. And that had an impact on the rest of Game 8. Bada described later that Kampala was so terrified after what had just happened that after that moment he never called anything in the game. I haven't watched it closely enough. I haven't watched the game after that point to see like if Kampala even called offsides. But Bada claimed that pretty much he refereed the whole game after that. Like Kampala was just there to drop the puck. And I don't know if he called offsides or icings even. I'd have to look very carefully, or did Bada call them all? It's possible. But what that meant was at least from that point on, you were going to have a relatively evenly officiated game. Canada managed to get out of the first period 2-2. Again, Ken Dryden was back playing for the Canadians. They made that choice to go to Dryden in this game. And they came out of the first period 2-2, which was pretty good given the circumstances. Period 2 is not a good period for Canada. And I think the score was 5-3 for the Soviets, right? I think at the end of the second period. And when the third period started, Canada had claimed they came out. Yeah, it's 5-3. Canada came out. Who scored in the third for the Soviets? Shadrin, Yakushev, and Vasiliev. And Canada had claimed later on that they were very confident. They were very calm and confident in the dressing room that things would go well for them in the third period. And the Soviets made a change. The Soviets went into a very defensive trap-like posture, a thing that they don't play. The Soviets would always have one style of play, and they played it all the time. It didn't matter what the score was, they would play it. And here, all of a sudden, they play a system that's normally played against them. Their focus was to hang on and survive the third period. But they have not been trained to play that system, and it certainly shows that the shots on goal in the first period were 14-12 for Canada. Even with all the penalties, the Canadians had more shots. The second period was 10-8 for the Soviets, but the third period is 14-5. And of the 5 Soviet shots that they took, I have trouble remembering one as being really dangerous. I think most of them were quite far out. The first goal is an early goal by Esposito. He scores in like the first 2 or 3 minutes from his normal spot in front of the net. There's a fight between Rod Gilbert and Evgeny Mishakov, the only true fight of the series. And it's Rod Gilbert. He gets into one fight a year in the NHL. His claim later was that Mishakov kicked him in the back of the leg, and that's the only reason he actually got into the fight. But the fight did happen in the next part of the period. Again, I think this was all that favors Canada, right? The more nasty the game gets, or the more not even nasty, the more theoretically nasty it could get in the minds of both teams' players, the more that favors them. That's just at that time. That's just obvious. Cornwall scores around the 13-minute mark from in front of the net. And this becomes the Alan Eagleson incident when he saw that the red light didn't go on, and so jumped down to try to get to from where he was in the stands to get to the goal judge, where he was stopped by 3 Army guys and attempted to be dragged out of the building. And that's where the Canadian players saw that, jumped over the boards, and you had this almost potential confrontation between the 20 Canadian players and the Soviet police and the army. And it was, again, that was a situation where in the Soviet Union, you didn't see that. That just didn't happen in the 1970s. Regular people did not stand up to that force. And again, I think this was something that to the players of the Soviet team, they were watching, they were in a dreamlike state because everything that was happening around them just didn't make any sense. The crowd, again, is unbelievably loud. There had been one member that had been arrested, some guy with a horn. He'd been arrested and he'd been in Soviet jail for 2 or 3 days, and the embassy staff was having a very difficult time trying to get him out. But as he recalls, the guards let him out of the cell, at least, to watch the game on TV with them. And then when the Canadians won, they released him. They just sent him home. But Eagleson knew if he gets out of the building, he's going there too. Of course, now probably a lot of people in Canada Canadian hockey players would have liked to have seen Eagleson show up in the Russian prisons. But at that time, the team was together and everybody was one unit, and they dragged him away and hauled him across the ice to the Canadian bench. But it's, again, one of these scenes that's staggering in international hockey, but it's showing the unbelievable intensity and the political fire that this series was under. A change had been made, which I said had been that with Parisi being kicked out, they had to move a player up to the top line, and that player they had 2 fourth-line players in that game, which was Frank and Peter Mahovlich. They first moved Frank Mahovlich up, who had played the first couple of games with Esposito, and Esposito pretty much did nothing in the first 2 periods with Mahovlich, and they had to make a change, and they went to Peter Mahovlich in the third period, who was a much better skater. And Esposito scores early. He assists on the Cornwall goal, and with 1 minute left in the game, when it was understood from the Soviet side that if the game ended in a tie, the Soviets would claim the win because they had more goals scored. This was passed on to the players, and with 1 minute left, they kind of said, we have to score. And the line on the ice that started that last shift was Esposito, Cornway, and Peter Mahovlich. And with about 30 seconds to go, 20 seconds to go, Henderson stands up on the bench and starts screaming for Peter Mahovlich to come off the ice and change. And he just said that he felt he had to be on the ice. He had to be out there. And Mahovlich kind of skated off to Harry, like, why are you taking me off the ice? And Harry's like, I didn't. That was that was Henderson bursting off from the bench, which was one of the reasons that he kind of wasn't picked up by the Soviet defenders. They kind of, because he wasn't there. Mahovlich is changing, and so they're back looking at Cornway with the puck. Everybody watching this has probably seen the goal. I don't describe it. But the goal itself is, as Tretiak says later, he can't figure out how it went in, because he felt he had that he was laying flat on the ice, that he had the bottom of the ice covered. So he had no idea how the puck managed to get under him. So again, it's this bizarre, mystical-like element of the series, almost like it's beyond what the players were going to do, that it's literally some sort of universal script that's playing out, and they were just somewhat of the puppets in the story. Of course, the game ends. The series is over, and it becomes the question of, well, what happened on the course of it? Because after the series is over, if you ask any normal historian, they'll tell you this changed hockey forever. It changed the way things happened in Europe. It changed North American hockey forever. Everything was different. Kind of. In Europe, it became very different. No question. The Soviets, certainly the Swedes, learned a ton. The Czechs learned a ton from their game against the Canadians in Prague. The Russians, the Soviets learned more than anyone else, especially in having to play against these players. They learned right away where they had to improve and where they had to improve quickly. They improved in face-offs right away. They realized the importance in big games of face-offs, because they knew these kinds of interactive tournaments were going to continue. This was not a one-time thing. They were very clear, this is going to be the nature of hockey going forward, that their best teams are going to be playing the Canadian NHL players more and more and more. So they had to get better in face-offs. Their defensemen had to get better in their own end, particularly learn to be more physical. Their forwards had to learn to be more physical on the forecheck. Because in 1972, it had only been in the last 5 or 6 or maybe 10 years max that international hockey allowed hitting in the offensive zone by the offensive team. Before that time, you couldn't check your defending players in their zone. So this was like a lot of these guys had never grown up with being able to actually hit your opponent in the offensive zone. So they had to learn how to do that. They realized their shooting had to get better. And they realized they had to obtain a much more physical element to their roster. Within just 5 years, so by 1977-78, the Soviet team, while at least half of the players are still there, Yakushev, Mikhailov, Maltsev, Vasiliev, Gusev, Luchenko, right? They're all there, with newer additions who are able to fill in these elements that the national team now says they need to be playing at. That team is, by comparison, that 10-year stretch, when people talk about the famed Red Army Soviet team, that's the team they're talking about, 1977 till about 1987, 88. That was 10 years. When you start adding Balderas and Drozdetsky and Larionov and Makarov and Fedosov and this group of players. But they were, in a sense, trained in normal Soviet hockey, but they were also now retrained on additional elements that they learned from this series. The reason that the Soviets became literally almost unbeatable for 10 years was what they learned from this series. How they rechanged their strategy of coaching, how they changed their strategy of training, how they changed the types of players they needed and what sort of roles they needed to be able to do. Because from 77 to, and I just off the top of my head, for World Championships, I can't remember how many they won, but probably just about all of them. But in any tournament where there was direct interaction between Soviets and Canadian players, the Soviets won the Challenge Cup. They lost the 1980 Olympics staggeringly. They just were not prepared to play. They won the 81 Canada Cup. They lost the 84 Canada Cup in the semifinals, really with a team that was better than Canada. Even though Canada outplayed them in that semifinal, the overtime win with Tonelli's goal, the Soviets were a better team that year. Just almost kind of like in '81, the teams were very equal. Canada and the Soviets. The Soviets won that game 8-1, the one game final. But it was only really because of the Perot injury that threw things off and some poor goaltending. But so they barely lost in '84. The '87 Canada Cup 3-game final series was unbelievable hockey, right? All the games 6-5. They were like, it was like as even as it could be between two teams. And that Canadian team was also a staggeringly good team in the '87 Canada Cup. And then by '91, the Soviet Union is broken up, and they've never really had the same kind of cohesive dominance. And by the late '80s, Canada has finally learned a lot of its lessons. They've finally started to change what they're doing, and now they're able to go back and compete again and be better than the Soviets as a team and as individuals. But for a 10-year period, the Soviets learned a ton. The Swedes advanced tremendously quickly in that period. The Finns were a team that, when you saw them in the '76 Canada Cup, they had trouble just keeping up with anybody and being involved in any of the games. By '87, already Finland's now a decent team. Yeah, they only maybe won one game or something in the Canada Cup, but they were like within all the games. They were there. And within another 10 years, once they developed some great goaltenders, Finland has become literally a hockey hotbed of building great players and building great national teams. All of that comes out of the '72 series. The interactions and what's learned from here's where Europe is, here's what we do well, and here's what we don't do well. And the things we don't do well is going to mean that if we can't improve those, we're not going to win. And they began improving those, all of those countries. That's a big reason why European hockey exploded in its ability to be equal to, or for a while better than, North America. In the North American side, as Ken Dryden had said in one of his books, maybe his last book, the Home Game book, he said, Canada won the series. In a sense, Canada won the battle but lost the war. That it would have been better for Canadian hockey to have lost the series. Because with the series being won, even though it was like literally razor thin, winning in the last minute of the last game, unbelievably, right, winning 3 games in the Soviet Union, the end result was we're still the best. Our system is still the best. Our players are still the best. What we do is still the best. And worse, that the 3 games that they won were the most physical games of the series, and the end result, which is not totally false, was that the physical element of the Canadian player, the determination of the Canadian player, the will of the Canadian player, the will to take any sort of abuse and able to score a goal, that's what the difference was over the Soviets. And so what happened is began to be, which was already starting, this idea of physicality and brutality and meanness. This got expounded to say, this is why we are better than the Soviets. It had nothing to do with how well our top players could skate and shoot and clear out the front of the net and win puck battles on the boards. It was literally, we were meaner than the Soviets. So that's our advantage. And we need to, literally, that was part of the psychological going forward that led to the rise. Because when Bobby Clarke came back to the Flyers, that was the year they brought up, Bob Kelly had already been there, but that's when they brought up Schultz and Selesky, traded for Andre Dupont. And now Bobby Clarke is coming back as kind of the king of Team Canada. Like, the 3 best players on Team Canada are Henderson, Esposito, and Bobby Clarke. And now he comes back to the NHL as a true leader to his team. And he now says, The meaner we become, the better we're going to be. And short term, that turned out to be true. The Philadelphia Flyers won quickly 2 Stanley Cups. And so that even entrenched more. Never mind, the nastiness will win you in international hockey. Well, the nastiness will win you in North American hockey too. And the copycats began to explode, partially in the NHL, where all of a sudden now teams you got to make sure that Gassoff and Polonich and Howitt and Williams and Jonathan and Wensink, you've got to find all these guys, but which at the time pretty much even Steve Durbano could play. Like Steve Durbano could handle the puck, he could skate. They weren't like the guys that came in the 1980s. This is not a whole discussion of that level of hockey, but the hockey of the 1970s has many reasons. It was a book I was going to write a couple of years ago when I changed it instead to write about the origins. But I've still got a massive amount of notes. I still could write it at some point here because I'm halfway done, you might say, in the research, which was trying to explain why hockey in the 1970s in Canada and North America was the way it was. Why did it all of a sudden explode in such violence? And I realized right away the normal answers that are given were not really the right answers. Oh, it's expanding in the United States. They're selling violence to fill the arenas. That's a very small portion of what was going on in the overall psychology of the way hockey was played in the 1970s in North America. Coming out of the 72 series, that's one of the big things, which is that's the reason we win, so we have to keep doing it. And it really wasn't until the mid 80s when Canada was falling behind internationally now against the Soviets with our best players, that finally some people, and through guys like Gretzky and Bossy and a few others, kind of said, we can't be playing like this. Like the mindset has to change. The mindset of what we're doing has to change. So they finally learned. On the flip side, though, some things did change. Certainly, European players first began to come in. Börje Salming and Inge Hammarström were the first 2 next round of Swedes of the national team to come into Toronto the next year. Of course, Salming was a tremendous player. Hammarström not so much. But it began opening the door. And from the WHA, when the WHA kind of opened the door, particularly to Swedish players, to fill the rosters. And all of a sudden, there's Hedberg, there's Nielsen, there's Schuberg, there's all these guys in the Winnipeg Jets and other teams. So you began to get that happening. You began to start to notice a lot more movement without the puck started to come in the NHL. There were some different, not extremely well. I mean, it was still quite an up and down game, but it was changing slowly. And you certainly started to notice the better teams doing that more and more often. What's really interesting that most people don't recognize about the 1970s, the 2 best teams, which were Philadelphia and Montreal, both in a sense, what they did better than any other team in the league, besides they were both, and I'm going to do my next video will be on the Philadelphia Flyers of the 1970s, of why they actually did win and why they've never won a Stanley Cup since then. But for all they were both talented offensive teams, right? Montreal with a much, much better and mobile defense. But both teams did well they were both tough. Because the Canadians of the late 70s were a very tough team, built to make sure they could handle the Flyers. But what most people don't realize is they both were outstanding at the neutral zone trap. They both, even though the Flyers were a high forechecking team, when they could get you on the forecheck, they were already clogging up the neutral zone extremely well. The Montreal Canadiens, the supposed fire wagon hockey of the 70s, if you watch the games closely, watch how tremendous they are in the neutral zone. When a team, where did Jacques Lemaire learn how to trap with the New Jersey Devils? From Scotty Bowman playing with the Montreal Canadiens. Where did the Detroit Red Wings learn how to trap so well in the 1990s? Same thing. He was the guy that was trapping with the Montreal and teaching Jacques Lemaire how to do it, right? The Canadiens' trap in the neutral zone was so good, it was really, really difficult for a team to, without some players out of place, without an overly strong forecheck and some players trapped in the zone, most teams had a very difficult time getting into the Montreal zone with the puck off the rush. The neutral zone play was so good. And so I recommend you check that out. But anyway, that has nothing to do with the Canada-Russia series specifically. So changes were happening. Players began to start recognizing that they had to be in better shape. They had to start training in the off season. Nothing like began to happen in the last 20 or 30 years. Nothing. But the off season training even I was doing in the 80s as a junior player wouldn't have been happening probably. That just wouldn't have been expected of you had I been playing before 1972. It would have been you'd play baseball. You'd play baseball and golf in the summer, take a break, and then get ready in training camp to get yourself in shape. So that certainly changed. The beginning of actual off ice training, but certainly to no level like the Europeans were doing. Nothing like the level of training, and certainly at younger ages. It took a long time for like Czechoslovakian and Soviet training ideas to start getting into younger hockey. And that was a big problem because even though some things were changing at the NHL level, they really weren't changing much at the junior level. Even like if I went and watched, when I would go, I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie, and I was living there. I was 9 years old. I was 8 and 9 years old when Gretzky and Paul Coffey were playing for the Sioux Greyhounds. So I actually I can't say I went to every home game that Gretzky played, but I'm going to say I went to 30 of the 34, 35 games that were home games. I probably only missed a couple for my own games. Every other game I was at the rink. And while I don't have a spectacular memory of all the games I watched Gretzky play, certainly what he was doing was so different compared to everyone else. Yeah, he was really talented. He was a good skater. He wasn't a great skater. But he thought the game. He was thinking the game in a way that the other players didn't really think. In some ways, some of the European players were thinking the game that way. He was really the first Canadian European style player, just at an even higher level than anybody coming out of Europe was. I remember the first game I watched him. I went down to the rink, with my parents, and I used to keep my own scorebook. I used to have my own, get the program, and they have a scorebook, and I would keep the stats of the game. Because I was curious, hearing all this about Gretzky, he's this big star. He'd had a couple of games already and on the road and whatever. So I started watching him, and he's okay. I mean, granted, he's 16 years old playing as 20-year-olds. So, but yeah, he's decent. You can see he's a fairly decent player. And I'm just marking down the goals as they go along. After all of a sudden, I'm checking the scorebook, and I realized Gretzky's got a goal and 6 assists. And it's like, how did he do this? How does he just got 7 points? Like I'm watching him and he's good, but how does he, And so you begin watching a little bit closer to what he's doing. And it did require, you had to actually watch him play many, many games again and again. And I managed to sneak into some practices and watch the games of practices. And I learned a lot just watching him as a very young player. Same with, I remember there was a day that same season, and it was like an autograph opportunity. Some games kids could go down and get autographs. So yeah, my father sent me down to get some autographs, and he said, "Oh, you should get Gretzky's autograph, and you should get this other guy's autograph." And I said, "No, I want Paul Coffey, who was also a young player." Or this might have been the next year when Gretzky was gone. Go get Paul Coffey. I said, Paul Coffey is going to be an unbelievable NHL player. And I remember my father's kind of looking at me like, what? Skate's okay, but I said, no, Paul Coffey. And the people were there getting autographs, and nobody was getting one from Coffey, which I was stunned with. And I went over and, "Hey, Paul, can I get your autograph?" Of course, yeah, sure, happy to. It's autograph day, and nobody's asking him. And I kind of said, "I can't believe no one's asking for your autograph. You're going to be the best player that comes out of this team, maybe this league, by far." And he looks at me as kind of like, your typical fan garbage of some kid. And but I guess I had a look on my face that was kind of like, No, I'm serious. Like this is someone speaking with some sort of understanding, and he kind of just then he stopped. He just kind of nodded along, and he signed the autograph, and just kind of like had a totally different demeanor. It's like, yeah, thanks. And by the time he was playing in '81 already as an 18-year-old, having that great playoff against the Canadians, and I was just like, I told you, Paul Coffey could be a great player. Um, just I had a hockey knowledge at that time. By the way, just since we're on the subject, many of you won't know this, so I'll tell you. I have a secondary interaction with Wayne Gretzky that people don't know. I have some interactions with Phil Esposito, Phil and Tony Esposito, because they're also from Sault Ste. Marie. But I told those stories. I did a sportsman's dinner with Phil Esposito. I was the comedian opening act, and Espo was the guest, the main speaker at this function. And so I told all my Phil Esposito stories, my interactions with him when I was like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. I had a number of them because his parents lived like the next street over from me. So I have all these Phil Esposito stories. And so it turned out to be a great night. But anyway, the Wayne Gretzky story, the interaction I have is through my mother. So at the end of the season, right, Gretzky, I don't know, got 186 points, 16, 17 years old. He'd been a star in the Canadian national junior team. He was like the king of the city. And there was a sportsman's dinner where they were going to announce the sportsman of the year for Sault Ste. Marie. The three choices that were, and everyone expects, it's going to be Gretzky. Gretzky's obviously one of them. Another's a snowmobile team who had won some snowmobiling competition in, the Northwest Territories or something. And the third one up was my mother, because my mother was a championship bowler, and she had won a number of silver and bronze medals that year at the Pan American Games in Panama. So I think the Americans won like every gold medal, but my mother was one of a boatload. She won a boatload of silver medals. She bowled tremendously well in that particular tournament in Panama. So she was the third one. And so they were all at this banquet. They were all together. And the amazing thing is Gretzky does not win the Sportsman of the Year that year in Sault Ste. Marie. And neither did my mother. It was a snowmobile team. I guarantee you, if I haven't had a chance to actually talk to Wayne since that time, I never bumped into him. In all the years since then, we've never been in the same space for any reason, but I would love to see if he even remembers that. If he even actually remembers that, oh yeah, I didn't win Sportsman of the Year that year in 1978 in Sault Ste. Marie. It was a snowmobile team. But anyway, that was an aside, the point that has nothing to do with the 72 series. Anyway, I think that's all that's coming to mind here on the specifics of the series. It certainly opened the door to all of the international hockey we've had since. The Canada Cups, which have been tremendous hockey, all comes out of the 72 series. And that even the 76 Canada Cup, where the Soviets did not send their best team. They weren't even going to send Tretiak to the original 76 Canada Cup because they were still upset with the game that happened against the Flyers in January of 76. And they were going to the first Canada Cup. They were sending like a very young team, and they weren't even going to send Tretiak. And if I recall, the Canada Cup organizer said, if you don't send Tretiak, just don't come. He's the best goalie in the world, so you have to at least, he's the guy every Canadian is going to be watching this for. They want to see Tretiak play. So, they force them kind of like, if he doesn't come, don't come, we're not paying you kind of thing. But the Canada Cups they became World Cups eventually, right? But these Canada Cups were just phenomenal hockey. The beginnings of building international hockey, and starting to build for Canada the realization that short term, we're not as good as these guys anymore. We're maybe even and starting to fall behind. So by the mid-'80s, an entire changeover began to happen of finally incorporating new understandings of how to train players how to do, and that lasted for a good 20 or 30 years. Canada caught up. The World Juniors were almost always a Canadian win, and now that's changed again. Certain things in Europe are improving, and certain things in certainly in Canada are slowing down. There's all sorts of reasons that are not totally dependent on the specifics of how players are trained, but that's a part of it. There's a change that's been going on. Anyway, that's what I have to say about the 72 Summit series, at least what's come to mind while I'm sitting down and doing this. Thanks for those of you who, the 80 or 100 of you who've listened through to the series so far. And like I say, sometime in February, I'll take a break now. And then sometime in February, I'll come back with the next installment, which will be a discussion of the 74 to 76 Philadelphia Flyers, the real reasons that they were so successful during that period. And like I say, the psychology and the mentality that came out of it that caused them to have never won a Stanley Cup since. They've played in, I can't remember how many Stanley Cups, like 5, 6 Stanley Cups they've played in, lost them all. And had a lot of other very good teams that could have at least played in a Stanley Cup and didn't make it. So to talk about almost, again, a short-term win and a long-term loss. But that'll be the next series. Thanks for following along. And at some point, maybe I'll get inspired to write this other book on 1970s hockey that I've had going. And until that time, all the best. Cheers.